Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the 11th episode of Life in Business. Seriously? I did that backward, but I'm sure people will. I'm sure,
Put it together.
I'm sure they'll figure it out. It's like a puzzle, you gotta make them think about it a little bit. This is the second to last episode of season 1 of the Seriously Business podcast. And this week we are talking about we've talked about resumes. We've talked about interviewing. And this week we're going to talk about how do you close on an offer, title pending right now. But the idea of getting that offer and then almost, I wouldn't say haggling it, but making sure you set boundaries and meet their expectations at the same time.
Without burning that
Without
bridge.
burning it, yeah. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, because I do think that's a very important thing. And I think maybe I should switch it up. Maybe I should
Okay.
have a introduction, because I have an interesting experience with this. So when I was in California, I was up for multiple different, I believe, internships at the time for my school program. And besides a few early on that really led nowhere or were just scams in disguise, basically, I did land one with a company whom I will not name, just because privacy reasons. But I remember how that went, because that was one of the greatest onboard to offer to doing work type of situations I've seen in a long time. Which is, I got there, first we had a Zoom call, right, in a Zoom interview. And that interview was kind of a light brush over resume information thing. And I remember when we were in that interview, we didn't really talk much about expectations or anything like that. It was almost like a screening, right? Then we had a second interview where I drove out to the offices and we did an in-person one. And I remember that was the interview where they grilled me a little bit. They asked very important questions and things of this nature. And it was an internship, so it was a little different. But I remember in that interview, something that came up a few times was the schedule, right? Now, while I was there, I had another internship I had to at the same time, one for a film festival and one for this group. And I recall having multiple parts in that conversation where I said, okay, well, I'm going to have classes and I'm going to have this film festival. And the way I brought that up was, well, one, they knew it was a school-funded internship, so that kind of helped. But I said, yeah, so here is my schedule that I'm working with. And I remember this was near the end of this interview, and they had asked me, okay, so what times are you able to work? And I said, okay, here's my schedule. And I had a printed out physical version of my schedule of all my essential things I had to do every week. And I gave that to them. And I was like, so here are the things, right? Now I know this event might change depending on the week, but this is the most consistent day. In the case it changes, it will change between these 2 days. And I laid that out like that to the hiring person. And they went over it piece by piece. We went over it piece by piece. And it was kind of a back and forth for about 30, 45 minutes until we eventually landed on, okay, here is kind of the flexible schedule. And I think that schedule was Tuesdays through Thursdays. I would go in for certain because I had nothing conflicting. And then Mondays and Fridays, I would go in if I could. But if I couldn't, I would be digital. Depending on the context. And some hours were different some days and things like that. And in this lucky internship, they were very flexible. So there were some days where something happened. They're like, no, that's okay. Just come in tomorrow or something like that, where we were able to make that up. But that's my, I guess, first real experience of that. Here is what I have boundary wise that I must fit this into. How can we do that? And a lot of that conversation, and I think of why it worked for us, is showing adaptation or giving ground is what I would call it, in the sense that I had that strict schedule. And they said, okay, well, so you have these days you just can't come in during normal working hours. And I was like, yeah. And they were like, okay, well, here's the problem with that. And I said, okay. Now, for me, I only wanted to work maybe 9 to 5 for this internship at most in one day. Now, I didn't have to, but that was my headspace, right? And because I only wanted to work so much, when we had to adapt and shift things, right, such as we had shoots or we had on-set production during some weekends and things like that, I had to open myself to be adaptable to those things. So instead of me just coming in and being like, this is my set in stone strict schedule and I'm not going to change it, you should go in with, this is my schedule. This is what I would prefer to do, but I am open to these things, is kind of how I phrased it, because that opened the door to me saying, okay, well, I'm not a huge fan. Now, I didn't phrase it like this. I didn't say, well, I'm not a huge fan. I said, now, because of these situations, I would understand if I would have to come in on weekends to make up for stuff, I can do that. Or if there is the opportunity for me to work remote, I would be more than willing to do that. And we can track hours, whether digitally, somehow afar, we'll figure that out. And coming in with offering those suggestions really helped me in that situation because it showed not only that I was very interested in this position, but I was willing to adapt things to fit it. Because especially with an internship, when you're going to school and stuff, it can be really hard to nail that timing down. But that's my experience with having to set goalposts, probably not be the word, but set boundaries. But at the same time, if you're setting boundaries, you should still have some flexibility where you come in with the concept of, I can do this to make up for this, if you have a situation like that, right?
Well, and what I think is very interesting about that example is there are a lot of co-op and intern and I guess just development type of opportunities out there. And that's probably a lot of your audience, right? They're either still in college, they're getting out of college, or they're in their first position. And so being able to define what the limitations are is really important. If you're going for a full-time on-site position, that might be a little less relevant. But if you're going into a creative position or it is a part-time position, that's really important around scheduling. I guess what I have found is there's kind of two sides of the employer's opinion of that story. One side, and it sounds like it worked out so well for you. One side is, gosh, this person's very structured. They're very organized. They understand what their limitations are, and they can explain why they have those limitations. And it's not like, I'm not a morning person, I'm not going to get up in the morning. I'd be really hesitant about saying that if that's your reason why you can only work in the evening.
Yeah.
But in your case, you had classes and you had another internship and you had requirements that you could explain, hey, this is part of this particular internship is part of my academic time. And so I have to make sure I hit those classes. And I don't know the person that you were interviewing with, but let's call them a they, because I don't know if it's a he or she, but they clearly liked and appreciated that back and forth to figure out what those boundaries are. And to your point, that's very important because when you come into a job that has a lot of flexibility and schedule, you're new, you're not known. And so the employer is taking quite a bit of risk that when you're virtual, you're going to be working. And I believe that most people do work when they're virtual. However, being on the side of the table that I am on, I got to tell you, I have hired, especially since COVID, individuals to be virtual. And 3 weeks in, people are like, I'm not sure we've gotten 10 hours worth of work out of them. And it's a 40-hour-a-week job. And that's a recipe for disaster because you don't have any credibility. You haven't built up any type of sponsorship and you're going to get cut really quick. But if you go in saying, hey, these are the times you're not going to be able to catch me. These are the times I'm going to be doing something else. But I'm flexible. Most employers probably aren't going, unless your regular work schedule would be on a weekend, they probably don't want to come into the office and meet you on Saturday or Sunday either. They want their time off. But saying, I'm flexible to do that, I can do that, And the fact that there was this virtual nature of the job, whether you were doing editing or production, I'm not sure, but I think that's a great example. The flip side of that is, let's say it's not an internship. Let's say it's not part of a bigger structure. You're taking on a part-time or a full-time job, and you have some, let's give two scenarios. One is you have some preferences. One is you have some requirements.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe a requirement is, as an example, I'm making this up. You have a roommate, or you have something that's personal in nature but would limit your ability to work outside of your control.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you have to take the train or the subway, or you have to do a ride share or something,
Mm-hmm.
and you can't get to work at 6, but maybe you can get to work at 9.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, look, I know your hours are 6 to 4 or 6 to 3 or whatever that might be, but I'd like to do this instead. Or I need to do this instead because of X, Y, and Z. I think it follows through the story that you told. As long as you could lay out what those requirements are. Most of your viewers are going to be smaller, but a lot of times it has to do with daycare.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I take my child to daycare. Daycare doesn't even open until 7, so I can't possibly come in early. Or daycare closes at 5:30, and if I don't pick them up at 5:30, I'm charged $25 for every 15 minutes that I'm late, and I can't afford that. So I have to get out of here by 4:45 because it takes me that long to get to where daycare is. Those are things that if you scope out and you appropriately explain those requirements when they're getting ready to make you the job offer, unless they ask for it beforehand, I wouldn't shoot it out in the beginning. The very beginning of the interview process, I wouldn't say, hey, here are my limitations.
Mm-hmm.
I would wait until you know they're interested in you, and you did it at the right time, right? There was a screen, and then they dived a little deeper, and then you started to talk about schedule. That's how that needs to work. And in my experience, many times newer to career individuals come to that very first interview with their demands. They're going to get cut really quick.
Yeah.
Because there's a dozen other people that don't have those demands. And so you want to get the job, know that they want you for the job, know that they say, gosh, this person can do my job. This is the person I want. Then you want to introduce if you have some restrictions. I think we talked about this in an earlier podcast, but a lot of times that's like, I have a vacation coming up. And I just want to make sure you know, because I've already paid for the flights. I've got to go to my sister's wedding, whatever the story is. You don't want to do that in the very beginning because you don't even know if you've gotten the job. Once you know you've gotten the job, then people are willing to be a little bit more flexible. I think the other scenario is people just have preferences.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're in a tech job or a creative job and the schedule isn't as important, this probably doesn't play out. But if you're going to go work for a big company, let's say you're going into an accounting job, or you're going to go into some kind of administrative job at a fairly decent sized employer. Let's say they have 1,000 employees or more. Most of the time there is a little bit of flexibility on hours, but you have to be there when the rest of the group is there,
Mm-hmm.
or you have to be working during the hours that the customers call, or whatever that might be. I would say if you have things that you just don't prefer, you say, you're not a morning person, or you really, you want to work first thing in the morning and then be home by 2 so that you can focus on a hobby. Maybe say you're a gamer and you want to do something in the afternoon and you have this game that always starts at 3:00. I would strongly recommend you not to bring that up even in the offer phase.
Yeah, that's like,
if it's a preference.
I think preferences, because I don't think preferences are inherently bad, but I do think preferences are one of those things if you ever bring them up, you bring them up when you're in the position and you've been there a while.
Once you've proven yourself.
Exactly.
Yes. But I just want to make sure people understand that there is a big, there's a fundamental shift when you go from college and internships to your full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of us in the older generations, and I know I don't want to get into a generational war, but when I was coming out of college, competition was incredible and it was impossible to land a job. I mean, people with teaching degrees, there were 4 jobs in the entire state that
Hmm.
they were working in, and people were going all across the country and having to move for jobs. And my husband got a degree in education and couldn't find a job anywhere to teach. And we probably had, I don't know, 150 school districts near us, but they were simply not hiring anyone. And so he ended up taking a different path, and he ended up in insurance, which I think was fine for him. But you have to be able to bob and weave. And I think him more so than me, because I worked to put myself through college. So I had to be very structured, that I had these hours that I worked and these hours that I took classes. And I found my classes around my work schedule, because if I didn't work, I couldn't go to school. So school was important to me, and that was the end goal, but it wasn't the priority moment to moment. The priority moment to moment was to have the income to be able to go to school. And so I was pretty structured, and it is, I don't want to say ever be dishonest or say something that isn't a characteristic about yourself that is untrue, but you got to sell yourself. And a lot of times you got to sell what it is they're wanting to buy. And so they come in and they want a red race car, and let's say you're a, I don't know, you're a Fiat. You got
Okay.
to find a way to sell those items that have the spirit, the intent, and the feel of the race car, even though you're a Fiat. And so that is the art of landing the job and being able to then find flexibility in the job. As an employer who's hiring people, a lot of times I'll have hiring managers come to me and say, I was so interested in this person, this guy, this gal. I was so interested in them. And then, we get to the interview step and they have all these demands.
Hmm.
You are really going to burn a bridge if you don't do that right, or if you don't wait to introduce it, because they're going to feel like they lost traction with other candidates. And if you really kind of piss them off, you're probably going to get shut down very quickly. And then no one at that company will ever consider you again, because you will have been seen as kind of unreasonable or bringing information up too late or too early. And so get the job, prove yourself in the job, make sacrifices other places if this is, you know, how you're going to be supporting yourself financially. And then little by little, think about how you can lay out, okay, maybe here is a great one. We typically, for my company, are relocating people to where we work, because we are very much an on-site company, because we manufacture a product. We have very few remote jobs, and we have more, but still very few hybrid jobs. But we have individuals that, maybe are commuting in an hour to an hour and 20 minutes. And right away in the beginning, if they say, I need a hybrid job, they usually get kicked out.
Hmm.
We don't know you. We don't know anything about you. You may have been a rock star at your last company, but to us, you're just some random person off the street. We're not going to give you that type of opportunity, especially when we have a lot of failures of people who have started being hybrid, and then, they're supposed to be hybrid on Friday. We can't find them. They're not online, because we can track if you're online. You're not answering your phone. You're not responding to emails. You're not on chat. That a couple of times is going to be like, we made a bad hire.
Hmm.
And people are going to be very likely to cut a bad hire in the first 30 days, because there's no skin off our teeth for that. Don't be that person. So keep in mind that there are always sacrifices, and you just have to figure out what you're willing to sacrifice and not. But let's say, for example, you come in and you do a stellar job. Maybe 6 months in, you say, hey, I wanted to prove myself, and don't say like, I was afraid to ask you. I wanted to prove myself. And now that I'm here, I think I'm doing a good job, blah, 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 blah. This commute is really tough. I knew it was going to be tough. I accepted the job knowing it was going to be tough, but is there any flexibility? That's how you want to produce it. Not, hey, I've been here, I've proven myself, now I want to. Don't do that, because it will end bloody for you.
You know what's interesting? This is, as you're speaking, this is a really interesting comparison to say. some of the way you phrase yourself in the interview, right? And here's what I mean by that. In the interview, it's always recommended, or at least somewhat encouraged, to always, and on your resume as well, don't use passivity in your
You
language.
use aggressive
You
words.
want to use forward thinking, like in your face type of verbiage. And the reason for that is not, you don't want to enter your interview be like, I am the guy. No,
Hmm.
you want to be just very forward and take credit for things you did,
Hmm.
right? Which I know for like me is really hard to do. I hate taking credit for things I did. But the thing you're talking about now of down the line once you're in a position, you almost don't want to come with the aggression. You want to come with the
Yes.
very chill
Humility. You want to have, yes.
humility. Like you want to be, instead of saying, I am a technological expert in yada yada yada, you say, so I think I've been doing this thing very well. And it's that very.
Well, and it's a balance even in the interview because although you want to take credit for the things that you've done, you also want to say, I did it with the team. I was part of a team. You've got to sell.
Well, yeah, I think that depends
Yeah,
on if your position was team based or not previously as well, though.
that's fair, but very few jobs are not team
Well,
based on some level.
that's true in the business world, but in the creative space, that isn't. A lot of creative space type jobs are
Fair.
individualist, which is why I'm just pointing that out, not to say you're wrong, but to say
That's fair. That's
that
fair.
that's just think of your context.
And
But
and so maybe this doesn't apply to the space of being a creative. My concern is human nature is the same regardless of where you spend your time.
yeah,
And no manager wants to have their employee come and demand something.
no, never demand. I'm not
Yeah.
saying to do that. I think
And
that's a
and
bad
you
idea.
you want to leverage the things that you've delivered. You want to leverage your great commitment and the fact that, I've come to work every day. Don't say this, but you want to find a way to say, "Hey, I'm coming to work every day. I'm doing my job. I'm getting along with others. I'm producing the work." Don't go to your manager, and I have newer hires that do this about every 30 days. How am I doing? How am I doing? How am I doing? Good Lord. I mean, your manager probably has 20 other people. They don't, and they work too. Their job is not to be a school teacher and tell you, oh, you're an A, you're a B, you're a C. These are people that have to get product done and material out. So I would say quarterly is the most. Half is probably better to go in halfway through. But normally 90 days is the time to say, hey, I just would like to have a conversation. I think I'm doing really well, but what can I do better? How can I excel? What do you see as my opportunities? What do you think I need to do more of? I think that's really important. But I think that you made the mention of, it's two different ways. You don't ever want to be disingenuine, but you've got to be humble
Oh, 100%.
when you're asking for stuff, and you've got to be flexible. I mean, I have a job that I'm in my career, I have had to leave family vacations to go and do something. I have had to miss family vacations because I had to travel to another country, and I had to assess what's more important here. Those are things that I regret. I think we had an episode about what we call it, work-life
Work life
balance.
balance.
If you are really somebody who wants that and is passionate about that, don't try to be a VP or an SVP because you won't have it.
Yeah.
You will always have to sacrifice. And unless it's your own company, and even then you're missing opportunities because you're not putting first what brings you money.
Well,
So it just
and yeah,
depends. Do you work to live or do you live to work?
well, and I'll throw that in as well because I think just even as a new business owner myself, I am convinced probably once every day I have sent a message or something, or I have to worry about X, or I have to worry about Y, or I have to worry about Z because people don't know, right? And one thing we're running into recently, which is just this nagging issue, is one of our people has a computer problem that they've consistently been having, and we're trying to figure out why. And we've fixed it multiple times, and we're going through it. And I just got another message today saying, "Oh, it's broken again." I'm like, so
Yeah.
it's like I think especially if you're looking, like you said, for life balance. Not that this is the point of the episode, but that's something that what role you're looking to be in will definitely determine how flexible you can be when landing it, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
if you're just because you're a higher position, that probably means you have less flexibility
Yes. The higher you
than
go, the
lower
less.
positions.
Yes.
Yeah,
That
so
is absolutely true. And that's where people have got to a little bit figure out. I mean, if you want to be a professional who moves up the ladder, and it feels like that's not the majority of the population these days coming out of school. I don't want to get on the rungs of the ladder. Okay, that's fine. That's fine. But you will always be doing work below those individuals then.
mhm.
And as long as you're okay with that, that's okay. But you have capped out your earning potential. And if earning potential isn't that important to you, that's fine. But don't ever do something that is going to limit you when you're in your 30s or your 40s, because your priorities will change. So the person I was at 18 getting out of high school is not the person I was at 21 getting out of college. I was a different person at 22 getting out of grad school, a different person at 30, 40, 50, etc. And so I didn't know who I was going to be. I thought I knew who I was going to be, but my whole point of saying that is be thoughtful and careful that you're not sacrificing the person you're going to be for the person that you are today. So those first few, and I took jobs sometimes, especially as we were kind of moving across the country. We made a couple of moves for my husband's job. I took jobs that I didn't really want the job, but I needed a job because we needed two incomes in the beginning before we started our family. And I took a job knowing, I'll do this for a year or so and then I'll go look for something else. But I wanted to learn and figure out how this experience was going to build my resume so I could get to the next job
And that's
and be thoughtful.
important
Yes,
because I think there's a lot of people who I know who are hesitant to take a position because it's not what they wanted to do. When you got to think, you got to, unfortunately, the job world, at least in my mind, it's a long-term game.
it is. You're a creative, and so I know you've had some. I think your internships were more creative, but you've shared some of the positions that you have had that were maybe a little bit more marketing or whatever. But think how those all built to where you are today with your business, right? You have not achieved your goal. This is a means to your goal, right? This is
Yep.
one of the things, okay, I'm going to do this, I'm going to try this, but you're making sacrifices in order to make this work, right? You're not making a ton of money yet, but you're making enough to keep things going and you're
Hmm.
putting your money back into your business. But let's say in 5 years, somebody comes to you and brings you the opportunity that you're like, wow, if I do that, it delivers X for me. I don't want to do it forever. But very few of us are going to take a job that we're going to be in 3 years. In 3 years, you're
Hmm.
not going to be in the job you're in today. Probably 2 years. You want to try to stay in any job that you have at least a year because we talked about this, I think, in the resume or maybe the interviewing process. Jumping jobs every year is terrible. It's much better to stay in a job a couple of years because it shows, one, that you can stick to something even if it wasn't the right job for you. You stuck to it, you took time, and you made that determination over several experiences, not just the first 30 days or the first 6 months. Two, it shows an ability to make things work and cycles of learning. You don't even get through an entire business cycle. It doesn't matter what business you're in, creative or anything else, if you haven't completed multiple processes
Yep.
from start to finish. And even if you were a creative and you were working on a movie or a TV show or whatever, if you quit that TV show or whatever it was 3 or 4 months in, you didn't learn the entire cycle. And so you're not very attractive and you're actually hurting your brand to some extent because your brand is very important. So your brand needs to be, solid. It needs to be somebody who's a hard worker, somebody who, will pay their dues because we all pay our dues. But you also just need to think, what can I learn in this job? And I think sometimes it's a little bit different. when my husband and I got out of school, probably because we got married as soon as he finished undergrad, and I was on a accelerated path. So I was done even with grad school faster than he was done with undergrad. It was a challenge because in getting married, we had to be on our own.
Mm-hmm.
But I think more people are going to college than ever before, and they're graduating from college, and it's a different type of competition in the workforce today than it was 35 years ago. But, you have a different expectation. You can go home, you can stay with your parents, and you can be looking for a job for the most part. So sometimes the hunger and I'm going to have a mortgage, I'm going to have student loans, I've got to pay, all those things sometimes is at a different level.
Well, and something I'll chime in on because I do think there's a lot of. And this is something I already know what we're going to talk about in the last episode, but I won't reveal it here. You'll have to go listen to it.
Okay.
But there's a lot of. I don't even know how we got to this point from landing the job, but this is important because I do think this will help a lot of people in that position. There's a lot, especially with the current day incoming recession and the many job layoffs that are happening in a couple industries. I don't know how many in total, but I know like creative industries are getting a lot of layoffs right now.
Mm-hmm.
And something to always think about is you don't want to be stuck in that headspace of doom and gloom
Mm-hmm.
because here's the thing, at the end of the day, when you went to college, I don't know, if you're in college right now and you're about to graduate into, I don't know, the film industry, the music industry, the video games industry, which is about to crash really badly. For all the people graduating into fields like that and other creative fields, you might feel like, oh man, this sucks, But let's, I think, be fair to yourself a little bit. You didn't know that 3 years ago
Mm-hmm.
that was going to happen, right? No one can predict markets that far in advance. If we could, we'd all be billionaires. But I think what's important is uh, when you are looking for stuff, you have to be open and flexible for reasons like that.
And more than just adjacencies. Adjacencies are
100%,
important,
yeah.
but sometimes you need to go outside of your comfort zone because it's a job and it'll get you experience.
And I'll give a weird example. Not that this sounds good, but I want to give it as an example. A lot of my income now is freelance work
Mm-hmm.
right now. And I know some people love being in that position, don't get me wrong. But I'll give an example. One of my positions is I run events,
Mm-hmm.
right? In this case, it's like tabletop games. And I run these events for pay. And while on paper that sounds like a fun, grand old time, to be fair to reality, I would like that to be I don't know, $25 an hour job. That's just not going to happen. The amount
Mm-hmm.
of work it takes to do those things is never going to be equidistant, and it's unpredictable. So
Right.
I can't rely on a resilient like 300 every week, every single week, because a session ends, a campaign
Mm-hmm.
concludes, and then it's like, all right, well, let's jump back on it on Monday and 5 more throw up and see if
Mm-hmm.
people want to play those. So something I'll say is, especially today, uh, being what was not a scavenger, but hungry and scroungy
Scrappy is the word we
scrappy.
use.
Thank you.
Yeah, scrappy.
Is a very sought after trait,
Yes, it
and
is.
I think that's something that I know people from college who did everything perfectly, got their 2 degrees or 1 degree or whatever. Then they did all these internships while at college. They worked at the bookstore, or whatever, and they're still looking for work today
Mm-hmm.
because they found themselves in a cycle of I worked at the same bookstore for 4 years. I did this for these classes for 4 years straight over and over and over. And that's great for a resume, but they then entered a field where there wasn't anything for them to do.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't have that scrappiness.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's something that if you are still in college listening to this now, practice that or find a
Yeah.
way to do that. Like, I think summer internships, if you're not doing summer internships, you should, because that's
Yes.
definitely something that teaches you new position, new position. Don't do the same one every time. Do a
Right.
different one every time.
Well, and I would say, so you hit on a couple things that are really important. I think that you want to leverage all of the different places. So taking the right classes, working at that bookstore for your 4 years, that adds a lot. But when you talk about it, make sure you're talking about how it added stability, repeatability, the fact that you're going to want to talk through that experience of saying, what that gave me was that ability to work with new incoming students every year and forecast and see the trends. And so that really gave me that ability to stick to it and see that there's a natural cycle in businesses or, at college campuses or whatever. That's what you would sell that experience on, and be honest. Hey, I did that job because it was part of my work study. I needed to do it. I needed the money, but this is what I learned from that. And I stayed with it because I really learned a lot in these spaces, and think about how you talk about it. But to your point, Jake, and not everybody has this opportunity. I personally would not have had this opportunity, but my kids had the opportunity of summer internships that aren't paid. If you can afford it, if your parents will support you, if you're still in school, and you can take a summer internship that's a little adjacent or a little outside of your normal space, or maybe it's within your space, and even if it's unpaid, that shows that ability to be able to change. Coming in new to the work space, it's not going to be like, I just interviewed somebody the other day and I said, he's been with the same company for 30 years. And every question I asked him was very much, well, this is how we did it. This is how we did it. This is how we did it. And the reason that I vetoed him was I said, I don't think he can bob and weave. I don't think that he has his own opinion on anything. He knows exactly how his company did it for the last 30 years. And that's all he knows. So that's somebody who should be wildly experienced, but the fact that he'd never changed anything other than moving up in the company. And quite frankly, it seems like the first time he didn't get what he wanted, now he wants to quit. Good Lord, he's 50 years old. I mean, it's too late, dude. It's just too late for you. You should have stayed where you were and just retired out. Don't be that person is the point. But to your point, having all those work experiences, and in my day, our summer work experiences where you went and you did temp jobs, working in a factory or whatever, because you needed the money. You were working for the money. And it also kind of instilled in us why we wanted to go back to school, because I didn't, my husband, for example, didn't want to drive a fork truck the rest of his life. And so it's like, well, I drive a fork truck in the summer because that gives me money. And then that's the money that I personally live on through my school period. Mine was different because I was being paid to go to school. So my summers and my breaks, I was working for my employer who was paying, helping me pay to go to school. I had a stipend with them, but I was working to get money to go to school, and I ended up staying with that company 10 years. But, you got to get experience, and that experience sometimes has to be, I worked at Target, I worked at Chick-fil-A, I worked at McDonald's. That's all fine. That's still work experience. Don't be hard on yourself. Don't pull yourself down because you don't get to go and work for IBM in the summer. I mean, take what you can get and figure out how do you leverage the experiences that you had. Maybe you got to interview in a job fair and you're a creative. That's all right. Talk about, well, how did you match requirements? How did you match people up? That's still an experience that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't done that. So don't be shameful.
I'll chime in. Don't do the opposite either. Not in the sense of like the opposite of what you immediately said, but I know people who had outstanding internships, crazy good internships, and then they expect they have to have a crazy good job because of it.
It's not going to happen.
That's not the case. Don't expect that to be the case because an internship's different from a position, right? Just because you're standardly good or even great in an internship doesn't always mean you're going to land a job with the same company or even an adjacent company. It's just not how the world works, despite how much you think it might.
Well, and a lot of big companies will leverage a ton of summer internships because they're very low cost. They let you try somebody out. And sometimes it's just, please forgive me for saying this, it's cheap labor.
Yep.
And so like my daughter this summer, she's going to be heading off to OSU, the Ohio State University.
The Ohio State University.
The Ohio State, which shocks us. That's not where we thought she would end up going because, she had a free ride down here in Georgia for a couple of state schools, but chose the Ohio State University, which isn't a problem because my husband and I are from Ohio State or the state of Ohio, so we're excited about that. But at the end of the day, I've been telling her the importance of having a summer internship, and she has the opportunity to have a summer internship with quite a bit of flexibility at the company that I work with, because we do a friends and family internship. And so this year we're looking for 25 interns. We've already started the interview process. You have to be enrolled in the upcoming semester. You can't, if you've graduated, you're not eligible. But we take friends and family first. And the concept there is, let's just be honest, we're probably not going to hire a lot of the kids that are in the friends and family internship unless they're in a different area, like our factory floor. Their children always get precedent. And some of them, because they're going to college, we have, I think, 2 in accounting this year. One of the guys does tire install. One of the guys does riveting. And, it's exciting to see the investment that they're making in their children. And we want their children to have an opportunity to come.
Which is a great thing to do as a business.
It's incredible.
And this is very rare, but it's fantastic.
And it's important to us as just who we are as a global player, in our opinion, or just an environmental player. And so, those people, because, their parents are in one completely different area of the business, and, they're not a decision maker, they're not in the senior leadership, they have a great shot of coming in and having an internship every summer and probably getting an offer, because we want to invest back in our people who make our product. That's how we look at it. My daughter, as an example, probably couldn't be hired as long as I'm in my role, because I'm a decision maker. There's really no place for her to go that I wouldn't have some oversight of her. But that's not the point of her coming in and doing that. The point of that is, this is a great opportunity for those of us in leadership to have our kids come in and get some great experience on their resume. She's going to spend a bit of her summer up in Ohio, a bit of her summer down here. We have work that needs to be done in Ohio with, I could send one of my employees up there to do it, or I could have this internship say, while you're up there, you're going to go in 3 days a week for these 3 or 4 weeks and do this work that's meaningful, important work. Maybe not the most exciting work for her, because a lot of it is copying and uploading digital resumes and digital personnel files and stuff. I get it. It's not that sexy, but think about the experience to put on your resume of, oh, I now understand the importance of compliance. She wants to go into the law field. This is not a law intern, but it all builds to, we do these things because it's the law. We have these things because it's the law. And because we have a couple of satellite offices, we haven't been so diligent in making sure we have those records digitally. They've been physical. And we've got to stop doing that. And that means you got to go back and capture everything. So anyway, now I'm talking way too much about the details of that job, but the purpose and why we've done it at this company is to say friends and family is, even if we know this is probably not your long-term goal. Let's say you want to be a physician's assistant. I'm never going to have a job like that in my company, but you could come in and work adjacent to our medical department, which is contracted in HR, and get a little bit of experience there. And so we try to find, first, we take, like I said, we have about 25. We take the friends and family first. Looks like we're going to have about 12 this year. And then we fill in with local students, because we want to give back to the communities in which we work and serve. But these are incredible opportunities. We try to pay really well, because we realize this is about them saving up money to fund the next year of school and the next year of school. And so I now, it sounds like I'm making a plug for my own company. There are companies out there like us. There's a lot of companies like us. We're relatively small in the bigger scheme of things. I know to you, we were huge when we talked about the size.
In my context of big and small, yeah.
But at the same time, that's not going to be a sexy job. That's not going to be a job. We don't have a lot of, like I said, we have very few remote. We have very few hybrid. So we're never going to check the need for anybody's box there. But if you want to be part of an organization that does everything that they can based on the constraints that they have, you can find those folks. But if you're a creative, you might have to take a,
Weird route. Yeah.
You might have to take a job like, a support assistant in marketing or an orderer in purchasing, or something that maybe isn't your dream. But, if you've got the right resume and you can show that you're scrapping, you've done these different things, and you don't come in demanding, well, I got to tell you, I just recently had somebody come to me in one of our departments and say, I had an intern. She was an intern. We put her to a part-time student during the school year, and she works maybe 4 or 5 hours a week. And she wants to be an intern again this summer. And her manager, it's one of our fewer creative roles, came and said, I don't think I don't want her as an intern in my program this summer, which shocked me because she works for him as a part-time student. He said, because everything she does is she finds fault with everything this company does. Well, you should be doing this. Why are you doing this? And I said, have you sat her down and given her that feedback? And he goes, yeah, I have. And I said, well, you need to do it very directly, because part of being an intern or part of being a part-time student employee is to learn. And you're letting her become a monster. And when we don't hire her, we've put that out into the world because you haven't said, I appreciate, Susie, your opinion, but you don't understand our job is to make money.
Mm.
At the end of the day, I don't have jobs for any of these 2,000 people if I don't make money.
Well,
So in
and
a
I
perfect
think
world, you're right, but we don't live in a perfect world.
that's definitely a problem with Gen Z too,
Yes, it is.
specifically because Gen Z, and while I have a little bit of this, I'm sure, I think the problem with the majority of Gen Z is they are so morally driven that they find barriers in everything possible,
Well, and
almost in a way.
and very judgy. So I had a Gen Zer just the other day. So we about 6 months ago we wanted to invest in a learning management system, which is a digital platform that allows our employees to go out and complete training classes, and we can do compliance and mandatory training classes, orientations, things like that. But they can go out, for example, there's 3 certified project management certificates you can get through the LMS. Now, I'm not saying that that's going to compare with completing a full project management course for a year, but it at least gets you the fundamentals. You can do Excel, you can do PowerPoint presentations. There's leadership presentations. We've got 10,000 different courses that we purchased in this LMS system. And I won't say the vendor, but, we went through a due diligence to collect or to select the vendor. We were somewhat limited on budget, and we were somewhat limited on technology because our systems don't support some of the newer, fancier things. And our IT group said they wouldn't help us, so we had to implement all of it ourselves with, middle-aged HR women and one computer programmer that I was lucky enough to hire, who did most of it for us, in all honesty. And so, we are humble in the fact that this is not our forte. We can get by with people helping us, but this is not going to be a real sexy modular LMS system that we can do bolt-ons with. We bought the best we could with the limitations that we have. And so I was talking to a Gen Zer who, is leading up a small piece of project work. To her, it's the world, but to us, we're doing it because we have to comply. It's not like this is something that we're all excited and sexy. We do it because it's legally required and we want to comply. And so she came in, she was talking about, she needs this, she needs that. And I said, well, we have this LMS, we're doing the implementation. It took us 6 months to implement it before it could go live because we didn't know what we were doing. So it just went live, I think, in early March. And she says, oh, I know that vendor, they're terrible. And so now she's been with us not yet a year. And I said, well, Joe, let's say her name is Joe. I said, Joe, why do you think it's terrible? And she goes, blah, 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 blah. And I said, Joe, here's the best advice that I can give you. Because, first of all, she's offended me.
Yep.
Because I've selected it. Secondly, she doesn't understand all the criteria that we're working for. And 3, for her to say it was terrible, told me she didn't even understand what it was capable of, because it's capable of a lot more than what we could even do with it. And so I said, Joe, I said, this is the thing you have to understand. And I walked through it with her and she goes, well, I just wouldn't have selected it. And I said, yeah, you might want to be a little bit more reserved in your language. I said, first of all, I find that incredibly offensive because you don't have the information that I have. You don't have the criteria. And then her eyes got big, like I was scolding her. And I said, and so, you're lucky that I'm a pretty easygoing person. I said, but everything that you say you need, it has. No, it doesn't. I said, how do you know it doesn't have it? I just know it doesn't have it. I said, well, I know it does have it because I went through every one of those 10,000 courses and there's enough to last you probably 2 years. Oh, I said, have you ever gone through the 10,000 courses that they offer? No. I said, so you need to be a little bit more thoughtful and a little less judgy.
Mm-hmm.
So now she's been trying to make up for me. But anyway, long story short, she had to launch her training classes and we gave her access, I think, to about 100 of the ones that we thought she might need in the beginning. She picked 3 of them and she goes, these are absolutely perfect. These are better than anything I've seen in the market. And so I couldn't help but say, gee, Joe, I guess doesn't suck, does it? No, I guess there's a lot I didn't know about.
I am
Now,
gonna bleep that out. Just
Oh, for the name of
for
it?
secrecy's sake.
Okay, that's fine.
I don't want people to
Okay,
think
I'll stop the story.
we're providing any
No, no.
advice or
Okay,
anything,
fair enough.
just for
Well,
context.
let's just cut that out then. Sorry, I went on a roll.
No, just bleep
Tangent.
that. That's
Okay.
whatever. But
What
no,
else do we
yeah,
have?
I think that we're wrapping up here. I think we're close on time, but I
Yeah,
think
cut it.
this is something important for Gen Z to understand too, because it's like I think a lot of people, and I'm sure I have this too to some extent, and I think over time I've gotten better, hopefully. But I think a lot of people who I know in Gen Z are so either set in a certain mindset or driven in a way that's counterproductive to what they have to do.
Well, I think unfortunately, and it was true when I got out of college too, I went to college and I can remember several different classes in which the professor would say, look around the room. You are the upper 5%. Only 5% of your graduating class went to college. Now, Jake, your demographic is different. Maybe it's 50%.
Yeah, it's probably 50-ish.
It's 50% of you went to college, but there's still, I think, and I thought it at the time when I got out of school, I thought it as I got escalated in my career and I met new and more college new grads, and I see it in my kids' generation too. I think colleges do all of us a disservice. I think 35 years ago, it was a differentiator to have a college degree.
Mm-hmm.
I think today it's almost become a price of entry
Yep.
for the majority of things. So you have to change your approach. You're no more special.
Mm-hmm.
You're no more qualified. And in many ways, you're not nearly as scrappy as the kids that got out of school and hustled tables at Applebee's and did tech school classes and stuff like that on the side. And when I say you, I would put myself in it, myself as well. All of us, we're no better than anybody else. But I think sometimes schools still leave us with that impression of because I have an undergrad, because I have 2 bachelor's and a master's degree, somehow I'm better. It was price of entry to get me in the door. That's all it was.
Well, and here's something. This is definitely something I want to talk about in season 2, if we ever get to that point, is I think the way college and at least the American education system to some extent makes you think a certain way that isn't really correct for the real world. And just to give a quick example, a lot of college is focused on competitiveness and being the
Mm-hmm.
best and having the highest
Mm-hmm.
grade and topping your class. When in the real world, no one cares. It's all about collaboration,
Yes.
working with teams,
Yes.
trying to make everyone work together nicely,
Having
which is
political
not
savvy.
it's
Yeah.
not taught. And
Mm-hmm.
that's something that hopefully if we get a season 2 renewed and stuff like that, that's something that I want to talk about for an episode because as a passionate anti-American education individual, I have a lot of things to say about that. But I think we'll wrap up today. I think we covered a lot, and I think at the end of the day, tell me if I'm wrong or if you want to add anything to this just briefly. The idea is if you're landing a job, right, or you're in that offer stage, you should, I think the most important thing to remember from this is flexibility. You
Mm-hmm.
want to be flexible.
Adaptability too.
Adaptability, yeah. Flexible, adaptable, and you want to be able to meet halfway. You have the
I think
things you
even a little bit more
want.
than halfway.
Well, yeah, what I would
They've got the
say,
power.
I would say is you should meet 75% of the way
Yeah,
and they
there you
meet
go.
25% of the
Yeah.
way. And for certain positions, that adaptability or the offer of changing what the role is not something up front, but maybe something down the line.
And I think too, to that point, Jake, some of it is you got to be able to read the tea leaves.
Yep.
So if you've ever done any kind of a public speaking or a small group communications class, it talks to you about reading the room,
Mm-hmm.
picking up the vibe of what's going on. If it doesn't feel like the right time to introduce it, don't introduce it.
Don't
Move
introduce
on.
it.
Say, you know what? It's not the right time. Today is not the day. I'll come back another day and I'll see when I feel like it's right. Then I'll introduce it. But to your point, it needs to be after you've proven yourself to some extent.
Yep. But anyway, thank you all for coming to episode 11 next week. And now I will reveal it because you've waited to the end of the
Well, I
episode.
don't know what it is either. Tell me.
Next week is going to be the title episode, Life in Business, and how you live out being in a position. How do you balance life, go to work, come
Wow.
home. What is living out that life supposed to be like? What
Mm.
is positive things? Because, and what are negative things? Because I think workaholism is a very big thing we should
Yeah.
talk about. And that's what we'll do in our last episode, is talking about what is the day-to-day life in business like, and how can you prepare for it? What should you expect depending on your field? Because creative fields and professional fields are different in that regard.
Mm-hmm.
What do different positions, contract versus full-time versus part-time? And that's what we'll talk about in the last episode of season 1 of the Life and Business podcast.
That's a lot to talk about.
It is,
Is
but
it going to be an extended
we'll
episode?
see. We'll
Okay.
find out. But
Okay.
thank you all for coming to this episode, and we will see you all for the final episode in a week or two. And yeah,
All right.
that's all
Hopefully a
from me.
week.
Hopefully a week. We'll see.
Thanks.
Bye bye, everybody.
Bye.